Hello, Lisa here. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to Tarot with Training Wheels. This is lesson number 4. So we're going to be beginning with Justice and moving all the way through to the World. Now, in the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith deck, Justice is in position number 11. You might notice right away that the card on the left from the Tattoo Tarot Ink and Intuition says that it's card number 8, because in some traditional tarots, Justice was position number 8. The keyword I've chosen to work with Justice is consequence. Now, I think often we think of words like balance and fairness with Justice, and those are also very apt keywords and ones you might personally prefer. The reason I chose consequence is because Justice to me was one of those cards that was so hard for me to wrap my head around when I was learning tarot, because there's also, near the end of the deck, a card called Judgment. In this case, it's called Rebirth. And I found Justice and Judgment were very easy to mix up, so having a keyword that really isolates the specific meaning of the Justice card separate from Judgment really helped. Because when I think of like legal stuff, Justice and Judgment kind of feel the same, right? Because we think of judgment in terms of a courtroom as like a ruling, right? And we think of justice in terms of law in courtrooms. So I needed a word that was going to take me away from the words justice and judgment and give me something memorable. And I really like the word consequence. I like consequence because what the Justice card for me in a reading is all about is some result of some prior action, mine or somebody else's. And yes, oftentimes in terms of consequences, the reason the consequence is being meted out or experienced is to bring something back into balance. So balance is certainly at play here, but the key defining moment or the big part of that experience for most people in my experience has been the actual consequence. Now, consequence is a word that can sound good and it can sound, consequence is a word that can sound negative, like punishment, but I didn't choose punishment, I chose consequence. Let's take a look at the Merriam-Webster definition of consequence. So one of the definitions of consequence in Merriam-Webster's dictionary is something produced by a cause or necessarily following from a set of conditions. In other words, it's basically a result of something. Something's happened and there's now a result. It doesn't care whose fault it was. Justice doesn't care if you had good intentions. Justice doesn't care what you wanted, what you meant, doesn't care about any of that. Justice is quite simply just the reaction you get after an action, or the reaction somebody else gets after an action, and all of the things that that means. So what I'm really looking for in a Justice card is the idea that there is this impartial force that is going to deliver this consequence that is representing that there will be a consequence for all actions, that all scales must be balanced. So we often see scales in this card, and I think that's a beautiful depiction of justice. And we see a sword, that idea that there will be a consequence, not always a bad one, but the sword is there to deliver said consequence if it's needed, right? And I think that's really a great way to look at the card. It helps keep it clear, in my opinion, and away from the meaning of judgment, which is very different. So I love the word consequence. It really works for me. Now, in all three of these cards, we have something that represents the element of balance. The scales in both the Tattoo Tarot and in the Druidcraft Tarot are represented here. But in the Oak, Ash, and Thorn, we have a wolf, and at first you're like, there's no scales. But actually, there are these beautiful little rock piles that have been perfectly balanced evenly. And we still have the sword, and the idea that this creature in the center is going to deliver that consequence, whatever it might be. So you're sort of faced with your own actions. And in a way, justice can represent a mirror in that way of like recognizing, oh, that thing I did way before, it's sort of playing out now. In a lot of ways, if you plant a seed and you don't water it, then the consequence is that it doesn't grow. Or if you overwater it, then it rots, right? So it's a similar kind of idea. It's whatever the result of your actions are. And I really like that word for justice. You use whatever word works for you, but this is the time when you're going to want to mark that word on your training wheels deck so that you can continue to build your tarot training wheels. We're going to go ahead and move on now to the Hanged Man. The word I've chosen for the Hanged Man is suspension. And I picked that word really intentionally because there's actual physical suspension often happening in the Hanged Man. We often see our main character in the card dangling upside down, and yet we also often see a hint that the person dangling or hanging in suspension is either calm, peaceful, or could totally choose to get down from there. They're often not being bound against their will. I shouldn't say always, because sometimes you certainly see that. And I think in the Druidcraft, you get the idea that he may have put himself there, but he looks like he's put himself in such a predicament that it's not so easy to get back out again. I really feel like this is a card about sacrifice and a perspective shift. The reason suspension works so great for me is because often suspension, well, let's just do this. Merriam-Webster says that is the act of suspending, the state or period of being suspended, such as temporary removal, such as from the office or privileges, temporary withholding, such as a belief or a decision, temporary abrogation of a law or a rule, and it goes on from there. It also can mean the act of hanging, the state of being hung, something suspended, the means by which something is suspended. You get this idea that suspension actually captures the essence of this card really beautifully. This idea that there is a sort of sacrifice, something is being held off on, right? And sacrifice is another really important meaning of this card. We're choosing to step away. Sometimes we're sacrificing acceptance and we're choosing to rebel in some way. In some decks, this card is really representative of sort of being that rebel. And so we sacrifice sort of societal norms or acceptance to forge a path that is uniquely ours. So you could look at it that way. In the Druidcraft Tarot, there's a sickle off to the side, and you get the idea that perhaps something about he's maybe making a sacrifice to ensure a better harvest. All kinds of ways you can look at this card. I like suspension because it also indicates the idea of perhaps waiting. And oftentimes when the Hanged Man comes up in a reading, I get this feeling like there's something that needs to be put on hold, that we need to make a sacrifice for instead of having the thing right now, instead perhaps holding back, waiting, pulling away from the urgency of the matter. And also the perspective shift of being upside down tells us that we might get a better perspective of our situation if we shift our perspective. We might learn more if we shift our perspective. Being upside down lets these figures see things a little differently. And in the Oak, Ash, and Thorn Tarot, being up higher, having climbed up this dandelion in the rain, yes, this mouse is sacrificing getting a lot more wet, but has now an improved vantage point and can maybe see the best way out of a situation. So you get the idea that by going through this experience of suspension, of sacrifice, that one can gain new knowledge. And so suspension really, really works for me. But there might be a word that works better for you. Always trust your gut on that. You can always change your mind later. Let's move on now to death. Oh boy, death is one of those cards that I think really freaks people out, and it freaked me out too in the beginning. I'm not going to even pretend it didn't. I think the important thing to remember about death is that it's so many things in our lives die, and it's not always people, right? Sometimes jobs die. Happiness dies. We go through little deaths throughout our entire life. We might experience the death of a relationship, or we might experience the death of a project when we hit this like end point and we just can't go any further and we need to let it go and move on. Ultimately, death is about that struggle to let go and to move on. And ultimately, death represents a necessary transformation, which is why I use the word transformation on my death card. I like the idea that it represents this moving away from the old and into the new, but in order for that to happen, we actually have to shed our skin. We actually have to release the old. Merriam-Webster says that the definition of transformation is an act, process, or instance of transforming or being transformed. And then if we go further and we dive into what transformed as a verb means, it means to change in composition or structure, to change the outward form or appearance of, or to change in character or condition. This idea that something definitive is not going to be the same anymore. And that is something we all struggle with. And I think death makes such a beautiful archetype for the idea of this kind of change, because it's the kind we resist the most. Who wants to let go of the known and step into the fully unknown? And that's what we see in the death card. Here in this more traditional tattoo tarot, we see this ruthless death just marching forward. It doesn't care who's affected. It's just coming to create change. Here we have somebody who looks like they're actively engaging with the magic and the transformation of change. We even have a snake up in the corner prepared to shed its skin and be a part of that process. We're definitely fully into this idea of alchemy and transformation. And then over here in the Oak, Ash, and Thorn, we have little butterflies. And the butterflies are such a great symbol of transformation. In fact, you'll often see butterflies shown in a death card because it shows that idea of having to completely stop being one thing, a caterpillar, go into a chrysalis, and emerge a butterfly. There's a whole different you coming about. That's the essence of change. That's the essence of the kind of change represented by the death card, a full transformation. That's why I like the word transformation. Next, let's talk about temperance. Temperance here in the Druidcraft Tarot is called the Feralt, which I think is some kind of smelter. Don't quote me on that. We're just going to go with temperance for now. But I like to use the word equilibrium because unlike justice, which speaks to sort of balancing the scales so that nobody is sitting heavier than the other or lighter than the other, everybody's held in equal balance. In the temperance card, equilibrium speaks to maintaining an equilibrium, which means sometimes you need a little more of something and a little less of something else. Temperance is about moderating something, bringing it into accordance with harmony. So oftentimes in temperance cards, you'll see things like the sun and the moon, which is a dual force that are held in equal balance. They're in equilibrium. We have half day, half night. With temperance, we often see a jug being poured into a wine glass because watering down the wine was a way of moderating or tempering the alcohol content. We'll often also see a smith forging steel because that is a kind of tempering the blade, right? We see this idea of bringing it into equilibrium. Here in the Oak, Ash, and Thorn, we see a swan buffeting or protecting these two little cups against this onslaught of water, half on land, half in water. The equilibrium here is to straddle this liminal space between earth and sea or earth and river. And so you get this idea of maintaining perfect equilibrium between the two. And in there is the gift of temperance. So oftentimes when this comes up, something's out of skew. There's too much of something or not enough of one other thing. There's an idea of things being out of skew. That's the word that keeps coming to mind. Temperance really speaks to that imbalance. So we need to do something to bring things back into harmony or into equilibrium. That's why I love the word equilibrium. In Webster's dictionary, one of the definitions is a state of adjustment between opposing or divergent influences or elements. It also says a state of balance between opposing forces or actions that is either static, as in a body acted on by forces whose resultant is zero, or dynamic, as in a reversible chemical reaction when the rates of reaction in both directions are equal. Okay, they lost me a little bit on that second one, but I love the idea of a state of balance between opposing forces or actions, because that's ultimately what temperance is all about and why equilibrium makes such an excellent word for this card. Let's talk about the Devil card. So in the Druidcraft Tarot here, we see Cernunnos, the horned one, and we have a couple lying in a garden here, having clearly enjoyed themselves, and we have a much more Marseille-looking devil over here in the Tattoo Tarot Ink and Intuition. I don't want to go deep into Marseille, as I mentioned at the beginning of this course. I just want to show you different ways you might see the devil depicted. In the Oak, Ash, and Thorn, we have a very interestingly mirrored card between the lovers, which featured two foxes enjoying each other's company in a blackberry bush, to here, where they're actually being tangled up in that blackberry bush. Similarly, there was actually a little of an echo in Cernunnos, which features the same lovers that we saw in the lovers card, enjoying one another's company. Let me just show you the difference. To now being in, like, essentially Cernunnos' garden, and they've become mired into this space. They're now in some kind of bondage, and this is the important thing. Everything here is restricted or held captive in some way. The blackberry bushes have entangled themselves around the foxes. Cernunnos is holding these two captive, or seems to be guarding them in some way, and this devil has these two figures chained up. The idea of bondage and the devil is not a new association, but it's one that I find to be really effective, because often in the devil card, what we're really seeing is that we've made some choices, and those choices are keeping us held captive in some way. It's kind of like justice gone to an extreme, because there's been a consequence, but it's like we've thrown ourselves full in. Sometimes what we're tangled up on feels really nice, or in some way is giving us some kind of pleasure or some kind of positive feedback, but it's not necessarily in our greatest good that we're locked up in this thing. And so that's what we really see here, and it's why bondage is such a great word. Merriam-Webster says bondage is a state of being bound, usually by compulsion. So the idea is that you feel compelled to stay. There's this idea of being really locked into your habits, locked in some way, held captive. And the key to the Devil card, in my opinion, is always that there is some sort of way you can get yourself out of that situation, usually by consciously changing your circumstances. So here we have these characters or these different figures in these different predicaments. In each case, they could disentangle themselves and step away. In this traditional card over here, the collars that are wrapped around their necks could easily be lifted over their heads. They're big enough. Here, it looks to me like they could just get up and walk away. And the brambles don't have them so caught in the foxes here in the blackberries that they couldn't just get up and move. So I think that's what's important to remember, is that it's bondage, but to some degree it's voluntary bondage. But that's the thing to remember about that keyword, and it's why it's a helpful keyword for me. I'm going to go ahead and move on now to the Tower. The Tower is a really, really challenging card because it shows something in the process of destruction. And I could use the word destruction here, and I certainly have in the past, but the word I chose here is a shakeup, because no matter how you slice it, the Tower is always about really, I think, an inevitable or a necessary shakeup. Something is being taken apart or torn down to make room for new understanding and new knowledge. When we experience a Tower experience, something we are attached to or embedded in is coming crumbling down around us. Oftentimes, and it's no coincidence that this comes after the Devil card, where we were in bondage, oftentimes it's because we've ignored the warning of the Devil. We knew something wasn't good for us or wasn't serving us or was maybe not the right path, but we stuck it out anyway and we built this whole tower up around it. And then the universe comes along and is like, nope. We're going to take that away now. So you experience this deconstruction. And in the process of having this big shakeup to your reality, to the way you look at the world, there's an opportunity to rebuild and an opportunity to do things differently next time. So as scary as this upheaval and this shakeup is, a lot of times a shakeup is where we have our biggest growth spurts and our biggest lessons. That's one of the things I love about the word shakeup. One of the definitions at Merriam-Webster for shakeup is to affect an extensive and often drastic recognition of, or to jar by or as if by a physical shock. So jarring, right? A drastic reorganization. This is the kind of energy that I feel like the Tower really represents. In all three of these cards, we have a very clear depiction of lightning striking a structure and destroying it. And that is really what we're experiencing in the Tower. Remember to be writing down the keywords that you want to use throughout this course so that you can have your training wheels. All right, let's talk about the Star. My favorite keyword for the Star is hope. I love hope. And it's because this comes immediately after the Tower. There's this understanding that, well, we've been through it. We've had this major shakeup. Everything's gone to crapola. What do we do now? Well, we realign ourselves with what we should be doing. We realign ourselves to hope. We look up into the sky, remind ourselves that the stars are still shining, and we set a new course. Now, there's a lot of words that could work in the Star, particularly words around direction and navigation, healing, but I love hope because it's really that moment, that spark, when we realize all is not lost and we can rebuild. To me, that's the essence of the Star card. Merriam-Webster says that hope is to cherish a desire with anticipation, to want something to happen or to be true. It also says trust, or to desire with expectation of obtainment or fulfillment, to expect with confidence, to recognize that things will get better, not just that they can get better. And I think that's what's really beautiful about the Star card. There's so much more here. Again, if only we had all of the time in the world. But for now, that's where we're going to stop. So think about the Star as the card of hope. And where does hope and how does hope show up in a reading? Next, let's talk about the moon. And my favorite keyword for the moon is illusion. Something is not quite as it seems, or we're faced with some sort of idea that isn't fully formed. There's something kind of bothering us or something in front of us that we need to uncover or figure out. And oftentimes there's a bit of a hint of fear to the moon as well. This idea that we need to travel through the wild and the domestic. We often see a dog and a wolf, showing that idea of wild and domestic, which we see in these two cards here. There's also often some sort of path or some sort of invitation to find out what is actually going on. And we definitely see that as well. But sometimes the card art just focuses on the moon itself. Like here we have this sweet squirrel all curled up on itself and this crescent moon that looks to be in the ground. Well, we know that the moon can't actually be in the ground, so it's something else that just sort of looks like the moon. And so we get this idea of illusion here for sure. But I think ultimately I wanted a word that would really speak to the dreamlike state of moonlight. The idea that things can look one way, but when you get closer, they look a little different. Moonlight doesn't show everything in its full clarity, right? We have this idea of like we think we know what we see, but we're not really sure. There's a lot of cards that show this idea of like something looks one way, but you can tell it's something else. And that's what we really get in the moon card for sure. Merriam-Webster says that an illusion is a misleading image presented to the vision, something that deceives or misleads intellectually, or the perception of something objectively existing in such a way as to cause misinterpretation of its actual nature. And it goes on from there. But I feel like illusion is a great concept to explore in the moon card, and it works great as a training wheel for just jumping off and getting to know what the moon could represent. Next, we have the sun, and the sun shows so much light. The sun for me is illumination. It's everything in its full light, whereas the moon kind of casts shadow and casts some illusion. The sun is the opposite of that. We have full truth and full clarity. Everything is exposed. I love the word illumination because there can be this sort of like new awareness that comes with the sun, this idea that we can now finally see what everything is all about. There's certainly the sun presents warmth and joy, and I also like to see authenticity in the sun, but ultimately illumination is that revealing of truth, that knowledge, the new knowledge gained. That's how I like to see the sun. Your mileage may vary, but Merriam-Webster says that illumination is the action of illuminating or state of being illuminated, such as spiritual or intellectual enlightenment, decoration by the art of illuminating, a lighting up, and it goes on from there. I think really when we think of everything being exposed in full light, that really to me speaks to authenticity. It speaks to being fully seen. There's also an element of sort of letting your hair down to the sun, as if now that the sun has fully revealed who we are, there's nothing more to hide. We can just be fully ourselves. Again, coming back to authenticity. I really like authenticity as a keyword for the sun, but I think illumination is a lot more expansive and works better as a training wheels keyword than authenticity does. So I really like suggesting that keyword to those of you who are building this training wheels tool. So illumination for the sun. Next, we have judgment. And here we have a really beautiful training wheels concept in the Druidcraft Tarot where it's not even called judgment, it's called rebirth, which really is the essence of judgment. So you could totally use rebirth as a keyword if that really works for you. I've chosen the word evolution because to me, judgment is that moment when you've heard a call. You recognize that it is time to step out of an old way of living your life or being and into a new way. Whereas in death, the change is kind of inflicted upon us. We are in a position where the change is inevitable. Judgment is a choice. We have a choice to heed the call, to step into that new paradigm of living, to transform such as it is. Here we see butterflies again. We have the choice to level up, or we can keep doing what we're doing and having the same results. But judgment/rebirth is definitely a card of choosing to evolve, to take it to the next level. One of the definitions of evolution in Merriam-Webster's dictionary is a process of change in a certain direction or an unfolding. I love the word unfolding here as well. I think it's really powerful, but it is a choice. It's something where we hear a call, we know it's time, and we decide to go, to evolve, or to not. And I think that's what's so powerful about the judgment card. So I love the word evolution. I think it really works. It helps me to remember the meaning of the card. So that's the kind of word that would work for me in a training wheels deck. Finally, we have reached the world, and the easiest keyword I've ever found for learning the definition of the world is completion. We've come to the end of a cycle. It's finished. Whatever it is that we're working on is finished. And along with being finished is the assumption that a new thing is going to be starting, a new journey, a new level, a new experience. Something else is going to come after that, because right after the world, we circle right back to the Fool and we begin again. And I think that's the beauty of the cycle of life, is that we have this constant journey towards completion, and then we start over and we go to a new level of completion. It's just like a video game, and completing each level and starting over to the next level. And then it's a little harder, and then it's a little harder, and we continue to grow and evolve, just like judgment demands of us. So the world being completion, it just really, really works for me. These two cards feature a much more traditional view of completion of the world, with the 4 fixed signs in the corners representing the 4 elements. Here we have the tools of the minor arcana, the cup, the sword, the pentacle, and the wand. But I really love the oak, ash, and thorn. Here we have a fully grown stag who is literally giving the gift of the world to their baby. I still don't know what a baby deer is called. Oh well. So you get the idea of this stag is completing its journey and is now gifting that journey to its young. The idea again is that this one has reached completion. This one has so much further to go. You get the idea that again, it is a cycle. And I love the word completion for this. I kind of tend to think of the world card the way that the Osho Zen Tarot depicted it, which is a puzzle piece falling into place, completing a picture. It's that last piece that completes it. The word completion just works so well for me for that reason. Merriam-Webster says that completion is the quality or state of being complete, or the act or process of completing, so such as completing school or completing something else. It works, right? It just really, really works. All right, it's homework time. So just like with cards 0, oops, my cards are all cattywampus. There we go. So just like in the Fool through the wheel, take your time and explore these keywords. Spend some time journaling each of them: consequence, suspension, transformation, equilibrium, bondage, shakeup, hope, illusion, illumination, evolution, and completion. It's important to really mine the gold from these words so that they make sense to you and this is a usable tool for you. So that is it for today's lesson. Remember, if you are enjoying Tarot with Training Wheels and you want to dive even deeper into this method to really make it your own, check out my Tarot Bootcamp for Beginners course at supportivetarot.com. That one takes this and just really, really amps it up. We go a lot deeper, a lot further. We explore a lot more possible words for each card, and you really get to build a definitive tool for yourself. So if you want to go even further, that's something to look at, but we will continue on. And for now, please do click the like button if you enjoyed this lesson. Please subscribe if you're new here, or click the little bell to be notified of my future videos. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and may your magic always shine from the inside out. I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye, guys.